During the early days of the pandemic, when we were offering drive-through communion, there were days when the weather would not agree with us. There were days when the sun would beat down on us so much that my wife implored me to start putting suntan lotion so that I would look not as burnt coming home. Back then, people would say, "Hey, PJ, nice tan. Are you going to the beach a lot?" "Nope, drive-through communion." Then there were the days when the rain was so hard it felt like we were offering the Jesus reversal miracle. Instead of turning water into wine, well, guess what we were doing to the wine into the water. But all that changed the day we got a tent. I want to say the first tent we used was given by Dan and Sue Drescher. And then a little bit later on, I believe Connie and Craig Batchelder gave another one. So the point was, we got ourselves a tent, and we used it. The tent was a blessing because it protected us from the weather, be it a hot sun or hard rain. And the tent was a blessing because we were able to provide God's sacrament with no interruptions. And so, when I read from Isaiah, God's own glory will be like a huge tent that covers everything. It will provide shade from the heat of the sun and a place of shelter and protection from the storms and rain. That's what I think of in that moment. Now, the word for huge tent in the Hebrew is chuppah, and it means a canopy, a shelter. These definitions point to something that God does that is quite amazing and also assuring: protection. Protection. In the ancient world, there was a worldview held by the pagans that the natural forces like the sun and the rain were considered deities, and such deities were very powerful and they were to be feared. That belief carried over into other religions, including the Jewish religion. The people, including those listening to the prophet Isaiah, believed that fire and rain, water, nature could hurt them, even kill them. So they would welcome any kind of protection from the forces of nature. But what God offers the people is not just the protection from the elements. The protection promised by God goes deeper than that. The book of Isaiah is named for the prophet Isaiah ben Amos, who lived during the latter half of the 8th century BCE. This was at the time of the Assyrian invasions of Israel and Judah. Remember, there were two kingdoms at that time. There are 66 chapters in Isaiah, 66. For those of you who will be joining us for our year-long journey, you will get to know each and every one of those chapters. Now, the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 33, addresses the period of punishment for not only Israel, but for all nations. So Isaiah then anticipates this period of restoration through which the Lord's sovereignty will be recognized throughout the world. Isaiah addresses Jerusalem's experience of living under exile and constant threat. Remember, they were in that perfect spot where Egypt, Babylon, and other people, when they would go to war, they would go through Jerusalem. So, when dealing with the bad weather of nature or the bad weather that comes from being surrounded and inundated with war and oppression, one can begin to wonder where God is and what God is going to do about it. And so Isaiah tells the people what God is going to do. Do you remember the story of the ark when God presented the rainbow to Noah and his family? It was a sign of God's promise that God will never bring that level of harm to the world again. I want you to think of God presenting the big tent, the canopy, as a promise that is not only going to protect them from the forces of nature, it is going to protect them from every single threat they face. The canopy is going to be the sign that nothing in the entire universe will ever bring harm to the children of God. Nothing, not even rain or fire, water, you name it, those deities were no match for God. In a way, the story of Advent and Christmas is the story of the tent that God provided for Mary and Joseph to stay and then to give birth to Jesus. The next time you see a nativity scene, I want you to take a moment and look at the top of the manger, the roof, and think of that as a sign that God the Father was present and protective of his newborn son. And that was what was really important for Isaiah to make a point of in this passage that we read. Wherever a canopy was, wherever a big tent was, that was God being there in that moment. God built it, God secured it, and God made sure it stood up to anything. I find it assuring to know that the same shelter that God provided Israel, Mary, Joseph, and baby Jesus is the same one that he gives us today. I think back to how our communion tent, our communion canopy, was the sign that we needed to show us that God would provide ways for us to be together, to receive his promise, and to feel his presence and grace. Tonight, under the wonderful shelter that this place provides, let us be reminded of the love, the presence, and protection that God, the one true God, provides. Amen.